In the spring of 1907, Adelaide Pruitt disappeared from a little mountain town called Briar Fork. Less than a week later, they pulled a body from the creek. And for 63 years, everyone believed they knew what happened. You ever hear a story so heavy with shame that even the mountains themselves seem to carry the weight of it? The kind of tale folks used to whisper about on cold nights, then fall silent when a stranger walked by? Well, settle in close, friend, because what I'm about to share is one of those, a tragedy that a little mountain town called Briar Fork tried its best to bury, but couldn't quite forget. In a hollow so remote you could walk for 5 miles without seeing another soul, Briar Fork was barely a wide spot in the road. Maybe 40 families scattered along the creek, a general store, a little white church, and more secrets than any of them cared to admit. If you got a taste for these old mountain tales, the kind where human nature shows its rawest edges, I'd be mighty grateful if you'd subscribe and stay a while. There's plenty more stories where this one came from. The last time anyone saw Adelaide Pruitt in church was a Sunday in late February. She sat in her usual spot, fourth pew on the right. But something was different that morning. Her hands kept moving to her stomach, then dropping to her lap like she'd been caught at something. When James Stamper, her fiancé, the man who owned the general store and was probably the wealthiest individual in Briar Fork, tried to take her arm after the service, she pulled away. Just slightly, but folks noticed. You have to understand, in a place as small as Briar Fork, people notice everything. A woman who stops coming to church, a man who works too late at the sawmill, conversations that die the moment someone walks into a room. And by early March, all 3 of those things were happening. Adelaide was 22, a widow. Her first husband had been killed by a falling tree less than a year into their marriage, and she'd spent the 2 years since doing washing and mending for other families, trying to keep herself and her aging parents fed. When James Stamper proposed marriage, it wasn't romance. It was survival. He was 43, childless, and needed someone to manage his household. Adelaide needed security. Her parents needed one less mouth to feed. The engagement had been announced in January. The wedding was set for late April after the spring planting. But something had changed between January and March, and everyone in Briar Fork could feel it. When women saw Adelaide on the road, they'd suddenly remember urgent business in the opposite direction. The few times Adelaide came into the general store, James's store, the conversations would stop mid-sentence. James himself looked strained, his jaw tight, his usual friendly banter replaced with curt nods. And then there was Ethan Combs. Ethan was Adelaide's cousin. Their mothers were sisters. He was 25, tall and quiet, the kind of man who let his work speak for him. He spent his days at the sawmill, feeding logs into screaming blades, and his evenings alone in a one-room shack behind his uncle's place. He'd never been much of a talker, but by March he'd become even more withdrawn. He'd arrive at the sawmill before dawn and work until dark. On Sundays, when everyone else was at church, Ethan would disappear up into the ridges. Sometimes he wouldn't come back until Monday morning, his boots caked with mud, his eyes red-rimmed like he hadn't slept. The foreman at the sawmill pulled him aside one afternoon. Boy, you got something heavy on your mind. You're distracted, and distracted men lose fingers around these blades. Ethan just nodded and went back to work. Now, here's where the story really begins. On a cold afternoon in mid-March, the kind of day where the wind cuts right through your coat and the creek runs fast with snowmelt, Adelaide left her parents' cabin carrying a wicker basket. She told her mother she was delivering finished laundry to a family down the creek, maybe a mile away. She wore her brown wool coat and said she'd be back before dark. She never came home. By nightfall, her father was going door to door with a lantern, asking if anyone had seen her. The family she'd supposedly been visiting said Adelaide had never arrived. Men searched the road by lamplight, nothing but mud and early wildflowers pushing up through the cold ground. By morning, 20 men were combing the hollow. They checked barns, sheds, root cellars. They called her name until their voices went hoarse. The search went on for 2 full days. Adelaide Pruitt had vanished as completely as morning fog. And then, on the 3rd evening after Adelaide disappeared, Ethan Combs didn't come home from work. His uncle found Ethan's shack empty, his few belongings still there, but the man himself gone. No note, no explanation, just gone. That's when the whispers started. Something improper had been going on between them. Folks said they must have run off together. But the whispers were confused, uncertain. If they'd run off together, why the gap of days? Why would Adelaide leave first? Nobody had an answer, not yet. The answer came less than a week after Adelaide first vanished. And when it came, it was delivered by a 12-year-old boy who'd been hunting crawdads in the creek shallows. What he found would haunt Briar Fork for generations. That year, the spring rains came heavy and unrelenting. Briar Fork's namesake creek ran swift and cold, swollen with snowmelt rushing down from the higher elevations. So when the boy came running back to town, screaming about what he'd seen tangled in the driftwood, every man within earshot dropped his tools and headed for the water. Half a mile downstream from the main settlement, wedged between a fallen tree and dead branches, they found her. Days in the current had done their work. Cold water preserving some things, destroying others. One man waded in, while the rest stood on the bank, silent and grim-faced. He pulled the figure free, and together they carried her to the muddy ground. Someone ran to fetch Adelaide's father, swollen, discolored, the face barely recognizable as human, let alone as any specific person. Creek rocks had battered the remains. Current had twisted them, but the clothing, that told a story everyone understood. A brown wool coat patched at the elbows. Adelaide's coat. The one she'd worn leaving home, work boots with cracked leather matched too, hair matted with debris but light brown. Same as Adelaide's. Thomas Pruitt arrived and saw that coat. The sound he made was animal, wounded. He dropped to his knees in the mud. "That's her," his voice breaking. "That's my girl." Moments later, Adelaide's mother came. 3 women had to hold her back from throwing herself onto what lay before them. Yet there was a detail, small, noticed by a few, though nobody wanted to speak it aloud. Mrs. Blevins, the preacher's wife, had employed Adelaide for washing nearly 2 years. She knew those hands, slender fingers, a small scar on the left thumb from a needle, calluses in specific places from years scrubbing laundry. Glancing at the corpse's hands now, she hesitated. Rough, yes, but these calluses were different, heavier, wrong places entirely. Her mouth opened to say as much. Then she looked at Thomas, sobbing in the mud, at Adelaide's mother wailing like the world had ended. The words died. Who was she to question grieving parents? The remains had been in water for days. Current does strange things to flesh. Maybe her memory was playing tricks. She said nothing. Jessup, a farmer who'd known Adelaide since childhood, thought the woman looked taller than he remembered, but he'd only seen the figure laid out on the ground, waterlogged and twisted. Grief distorts memory, doesn't it? He kept his observation to himself. Quickly, the decision was made. Preparation for burial. What little was possible after days submerged, the coffin would be closed. Adelaide's parents wouldn't have to see their daughter's ruined face. 2 days passed. Adelaide Pruitt was buried in the little cemetery behind the white church. Pastor Blevins kept his sermon short, speaking of tragedy and the Lord's mysterious ways. Hollow, though. Something uneasy in how people stood at the graveside. Nobody lingered. They filled in the grave, placed a simple wooden marker, went home. Ethan Combs was still missing. A day or two, people assumed grief had driven him off, unable to bear what had happened to his cousin. Perhaps he blamed himself for not protecting her. Perhaps shame over whatever had been going on between them. Then the stories started coming in. Grief turned to something uglier. About a week after the burial, a traveling peddler came through town, making his rounds through the mountains, selling pots and medicine. At the general store, he heard about Adelaide's death. What he said next made everyone go quiet. Saw an odd thing, the peddler said, leaning against the counter. Maybe 4-5 days before you found that girl. Coming down the creek road around dusk, I heard voices arguing, loud, angry. Looked over toward where the old lumber bridge used to stand, and there were 2 people, a man and a woman. He was tall, shouting something I couldn't make out. She wore a dark coat. They moved into the trees before I could see faces clear. Behind the counter, James Stamper spoke up. That bridge sits maybe 200 yards upstream from where they found Adelaide. Ethan Combs is tall, someone else added. Ugly and inevitable, the pieces fell into place. Then came a second discovery. Cleaning up Ethan's abandoned work area at the sawmill, he'd left in such haste that tools lay scattered everywhere. The crew found an object wedged between 2 planks, half buried in sawdust. A small carved wooden pin, the kind women used for fastening shawls. Delicate work, with initials scratched into the back. A.P. Adelaide Pruitt. The mill foreman held it to the light, turning it over in his calloused fingers. Why would Ethan have this? Maybe Adelaide had given it to him for safekeeping, someone suggested. But the way it was hidden, wedged down between boards like he'd been trying to conceal it, that didn't sit right. And then someone remembered the marks. Before burial, the undertaker had noticed bruising on the neck. Faint, visible, a pattern that could have been from hands, from someone gripping hard. News reached the county sheriff. He rode up, listened to the peddler's account, examined the shawl pin, reviewed the undertaker's observations about bruising. Then he organized a manhunt. Ethan Combs is wanted for questioning in the death of Adelaide Pruitt, the sheriff announced. Anyone who sees him or knows his whereabouts, come forward immediately. Posses formed. Men with rifles and dogs combed the ridges, checking every cave and abandoned cabin within 20 miles. Wanted notices went up in surrounding towns and settlements. The description was clear. Tall, dark-haired, dangerous, possibly armed. Ethan was never found. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The search expanded, then slowly wound down. Either he'd gotten far away, or he was dead in some unmarked hollow where nobody would ever find him. An uneasy peace settled over Briar Fork. The story hardened into certainty. Ethan Combs had killed his cousin Adelaide, probably in some argument gone wrong, maybe over their improper relationship, then fled like a coward. Shameful, tragic, but at least it made sense. Clear villain, clear victim, an explanation, even if justice would never be served. Within the year, Adelaide's parents moved away, unable to bear the sympathetic looks, the constant reminders. James Stamper grew quieter, older, spending more time alone in his store's back room. The white church continued its services. The sawmill continued cutting timber. Life went on. The story became a cautionary tale, a warning about what happens when family relations become improper, when young people follow passion instead of propriety. Parents used it to frighten their daughters into obedience. There the story stayed, closed, settled, filed away in Briar Fork's collective memory as a tragedy resolved, a mystery solved, a lesson learned. 63 years passed. Nobody questioned it. Nobody wondered if maybe, just maybe, the story they'd all agreed on was too convenient, too clean, too easy to believe. But truth? Truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried 6 feet deep under a false name. Sometimes all it takes is one person finding a relic that should have stayed buried. An old journal, a quilt with hidden stitches, a letter that should have been burned for the whole careful story to unravel. That's what happened in 1970. When it did, everything Briar Fork thought it knew about Adelaide Pruitt and Ethan Combs turned out to be a lie. Every last word of it. Years folded into decades. Those who'd known Adelaide and Ethan firsthand died off one by one, taking their memories with them. By the 1940s, what happened had become something parents told to warn daughters about improper affections. By the 1960s, most people in Briar Fork had forgotten Adelaide's face, forgotten what Ethan's voice sounded like. What remained were just the bones, the murdered woman, the cousin who killed her and fled, a ghost story fading into the mountains. Except that in 1970, a woman named Dorothy Couch started going through her late mother's belongings. Beulah Combs Couch, her mother, had been Ethan's younger sister, which made Dorothy his niece, though she'd never met her uncle. He'd vanished long before she was born, leaving behind only whispers and shame. The funeral was over. The house needed clearing. Dorothy started with the bedroom, working through drawers and closets, sorting what to keep from what to discard. In the back of the closet stood a cedar chest. Inside, old linens, baby clothes, fabric scraps, normal things, expected things. Then tucked inside an old Bible, a small journal. Not a diary with daily entries, but more of a household ledger. Beulah had recorded recipes here, fabric measurements, bits of family history. The handwriting was her mother's, careful, precise. Dorothy flipped through pages about preserving vegetables, making soap, a recipe for apple butter. A cluster of entries from spring 1907 stopped her cold. These were different, cryptic, heavy with weight unsaid. A came to me after dark. She was weeping. I told her I would help. May the Lord have mercy on us all. Help them get away before dawn. Gave what money I had. Pray they make it. This secret will kill me, but speaking it would kill more. On her mother's bedroom floor, Dorothy sat with the journal trembling in her grasp. She read the entries again and again. Who was A? Who were them? What had Beulah helped with? The entries raised more questions than they answered. She kept digging through the cedar chest. Beneath more linens, a quilt emerged. One of those traditional mountain quilts made from dozens of fabric scraps in a pattern called wedding ring. Most of the pieces were ordinary: calico, homespun, flour sack fabric. One square caught her attention, tucked into a corner, barely visible unless you were looking for it. Deep blue fabric, finer than the rest. Embroidered in tiny white stitches were initials: A.P. plus E.C., Adelaide Pruitt, and Ethan Combs. Her pulse quickened. This wasn't the quilt of a murderer and victim. This was something you'd make to commemorate love, to remember something precious, something you wanted to keep alive. Growing up, Dorothy had heard the accepted version: Ethan the murderer, Adelaide the victim. A cautionary tale about forbidden passion leading to violence. Yet this quilt suggested another truth altogether. This quilt hinted at something between them, genuine, worth hiding in stitches that would outlast both their lives. If Adelaide and Ethan had been in love, why the violence? Why murder? Unless everything she'd been told was wrong, one person might still hold the truth. Her aunt, Sarah Combs, 92 years old, living in a nursing home in a nearby town. Sarah was Beulah's younger sister, which meant she'd been alive when it all happened. Just a child, maybe, but old enough to remember. Dorothy brought the journal and the embroidered square with her. By a window, Sarah sat when Dorothy arrived, frail fingers folded in her lap, eyes still sharp despite her age. When Dorothy showed her the journal entries and the stitched initials, something shifted in the old woman's expression. Tears welled up. "I wondered if this would ever surface," Sarah said quietly. "I've kept it buried so long, I almost convinced myself it wasn't real." "What wasn't real, Aunt Sarah?" Silence stretched between them. Sarah stared at the blue fabric with its careful stitches, like she was peering through time itself. Then she spoke, and what she revealed changed everything Dorothy believed she understood. "They were in love," Sarah said simply. "Adelaide and Ethan. Had been for years, probably, though nobody saw it at first." The floor tilted beneath Dorothy's feet. "But the tale everyone tells is a lie." Sarah's voice was firm despite its frailty. "Ethan didn't kill Adelaide. They ran away together." The words hung suspended in the air. Dorothy's thoughts raced. But the body? The one they pulled from the creek. If Adelaide ran away, then who? "I don't have all the details," Sarah interrupted, shaking her head. "I was only 14 when it happened, but I witnessed Beulah helping them, saw her sneaking food, gathering supplies, and I recognized Adelaide's terror, not of Ethan, but of what would happen if anyone discovered the truth." "Discovered what?" Sarah's gaze met hers. Adelaide was carrying Ethan's baby. The room seemed to spin. "And they were first cousins," Sarah continued. "Their mothers were sisters. You grasp what that meant back then? In a place like Briar Fork?" Dorothy nodded slowly. Understanding was beginning to dawn. But Adelaide was also engaged to James Stamper, Sarah added, the wealthiest man in the hollow. Breaking that engagement would have been scandal enough, but to break it because she was pregnant with her cousin's child? 3 kinds of scandal rolled into one. It would have destroyed 3 families, Sarah said quietly. Adelaide's, Ethan's, James's. The shame would have been unbearable. They would have been run out of the mountains, maybe worse. So they did the only thing they could. They fled. Dorothy's voice came out barely above a whisper. But who did they bury in Adelaide's grave? Sarah's expression went carefully neutral. That's the question, isn't it? Beulah never told me straight, and I never asked. Some secrets you keep because speaking them makes you complicit. She paused, her ancient eyes holding Dorothy's. But I'll tell you this much. Beulah encountered someone who'd already passed, someone nobody would miss, and she made a choice that haunted her the rest of her life. Dorothy left the nursing home with one thing crystal clear. The narrative everyone had believed for 63 years was built on lies. Yet, if Adelaide was alive when she left Briar Fork, then who was the woman they'd pulled from the creek? The next morning, Dorothy retrieved the journal again, this time paying attention to every word, every line that seemed to carry more weight than it should. That's when she saw it. An entry she'd glossed over initially, written just days before Adelaide's body was supposedly discovered, found what we needed. She was already cold, no family to mourn. May God forgive what I'm about to do. Dorothy's blood went cold. She read it again and again. She was already cold. Not she was cold, meaning alive but chilled, but she was already cold. Past tense. Dead before Beulah encountered her. Her fingers trembling, Dorothy flipped to the next entry, written the day after Adelaide's body was pulled from the creek. They buried someone today, but it wasn't her. It wasn't Adelaide. I dressed her in A's coat, put her in the water where she'd be found. God help me, I used a dead woman to save a living one. The journal slipped from Dorothy's grasp. The full picture assembled itself in her mind with horrible clarity. Adelaide and Ethan hadn't just run away. They'd staged Adelaide's death, and Beulah had helped them do it by discovering the corpse of another woman, some unknown traveler or drifter who died of cold or sickness on the road, and dressing that remains in Adelaide's clothing. They'd placed the body in the creek where it would be identified as Adelaide. Brilliant in its desperation, horrifying in its execution, the remains in Adelaide Pruitt's grave wasn't Adelaide at all. It was some nameless woman whose death had been convenient, whose identity had been erased, who'd been buried under a stranger's name so 2 desperate people could escape. Dorothy's mind raced through the implications, the evidence against Ethan, the argument the peddler witnessed, the shawl pin at the sawmill, the marks on the neck. All of it could be explained differently now. Perhaps the peddler had seen them planning their escape. Perhaps Adelaide had given Ethan the pin as a keepsake. Perhaps the marks had nothing to do with strangulation at all, just damage from days in the creek, or marks people saw because they expected to see them. The community had wanted to believe in murder. Murder was simple: clear villain, clear victim, clear judgment. But the truth was messier. Adelaide and Ethan weren't killer and victim. They were 2 people trapped in an impossible situation, in love, expecting a child, related by blood in a way their community would never forgive. Beulah, loyal sister, had helped them fake Adelaide's death by committing an act that would haunt her forever. Dorothy thought about her mother living with this weight for 60 years, going to church every Sunday singing hymns, praying to a God she wasn't sure would forgive her. What kind of burden does that create? How do you live with yourself when you can't determine whether what you did was mercy or sin? Dorothy read the final entry in the journal, written months after Adelaide disappeared. No word from them. Don't know if they made it or if they're lying dead in some unmarked grave out west. Maybe it's better not to know. Did what I did out of love, but love doesn't make it right. That woman I used, she deserved better, deserved her own name, her own grave, people to mourn her. Instead, I turned her into a ghost so Adelaide could live. Some days I think that was mercy. Other days I think it was the worst sin I ever committed. I'll never know which. I'll carry that confusion to my own grave. Dorothy closed the journal. She sat in her mother's empty house, surrounded by the remnants of a life lived under an impossible secret shadow. And she reached a decision. She wouldn't go public, wouldn't write to newspapers or try to correct the historical record. Because what good would it accomplish? Adelaide and Ethan were long gone, probably dead. Beulah was dead. James Stamper was dead. Everyone directly involved had already met whatever judgment awaited them. And that unknown woman in the grave, she remained nameless. Dorothy couldn't restore her identity, couldn't undo what had been done. So Dorothy returned the journal and the embroidered square to the cedar chest. Kept them, but kept them private. Years later, when she passed, those items transferred to another family member, who eventually shared the account quietly, carefully, with a few trusted people who collect these old mountain tales. And that's how it came down to folks like me. Not as documented fact, not as something you'll locate in courthouse records, but as one of those narratives that lives in the cracks, passed down, half believed, impossible to prove, but too detailed to dismiss. A narrative about the lies we tell to survive, and the truths we bury to protect the people we love. So here we are, friend, more than 100 years later, and we're left with the question that has no answer. Who was the woman in the creek? She was someone's daughter, probably. Maybe someone's sister or wife. A person who lived and breathed and had her own story. But all of that was erased when Beulah Combs found her remains and made a choice. They say she's buried in that little cemetery behind the white church under a marker that reads Adelaide Pruitt, 1885 to 1907. Except she wasn't Adelaide, and she has been forgotten. That's what haunts me most, this nameless woman whose existence mattered so little that nobody even noticed she was missing. Was what Beulah did a mercy or a sin? I think the answer is yes, both. All of those things at once. She saved two people from a fate that might have been worse than death. But she used a human being like a prop, turned a woman who'd already died into a fabrication. That woman deserved her own grave, her own name, people to mourn her. The woman in that grave, she's the casualty of everyone else's impossible choices. Every burden kept is an account erased. Every account erased is a piece of humanity lost. And sometimes the people we lose aren't the ones who ran away. They're the ones we never bothered to remember in the first place. I reckon the real sin of Briar Fork, wasn't the love between Adelaide and Ethan, and it wasn't even Beulah's desperate act. The real sin was creating a world where people had to make choices like that in the first place. A world where love could be so unforgivable that death seemed like the only way out. The community of Briar Fork chose to believe the worst about Ethan because it was easier than facing the complicated truth. They chose judgment over curiosity, certainty over doubt, and in doing so, they made themselves complicit in a lie that lasted 63 years. I'm not saying I know who was right or wrong. What I'm saying is that none of us know how we'd act if we were trapped in a situation that desperate, that impossible. 63 years of lies, and then a woman going through her mother's things finds a journal and a quilt square, and suddenly the whole careful fabrication unravels. I don't have answers for you, friend, but I do have questions. When we hear a tale that seems too simple, too neatly wrapped up with clear villains and victims, do we dig deeper, or do we accept it because it's easier? And finally, how many people are we willing to erase to maintain the version we want to believe? So what do you think, friend? Was Beulah right to help them? Was using that unknown woman's remains a necessary evil or just evil? Should Adelaide and Ethan have stayed and faced the consequences, or were they right to flee? I don't have the answers. All I have is this old mountain tale and the questions it leaves behind. If this story made you think, if it stirred something in you about the weight of secrets and the price of judgment, I'd be honored if you'd leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Beulah's place, in Adelaide's, in Ethan's? And if you want more tales like this, the kind that ask hard questions and don't always give easy answers, the kind that remind us that people are complicated and the past is messy, I'd be grateful if you'd subscribe. There's more stories from these mountains waiting to be told. Take care of yourself, friend, and maybe remember that every person you meet is carrying stories you'll never hear. Maybe that'll make us all a little kinder, a little less quick to judge. Because in the end, we're all just trying to survive in a world that doesn't always give us good choices. And maybe, just maybe, that deserves a little more compassion than we usually offer. Until next time, and if you ever find yourself wandering those mountain roads, say a quiet prayer for the woman with no name. She deserves at least that much.